like, but like I just said, it just started recording, so it will be like on the recording. And we do ask that if you don't mind mute yourself, just so we don't have a bunch of background noise. But if you have questions that come up, you can pop them in the chat. You can chat me individually. I will be kind of like moderating and monitoring all of that while Elizabeth um, is doing her presentation. So if any questions arise, that'll um, come to me. So, and then at the end, we will have, like a time for questions set aside. So, all right. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Jeglic, for being willing to come on and talk to us this afternoon. And I will go ahead and let you get started.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you about this really important topic. And it's kind of a topic that is under researched and under talked about, partly goes into the history of, how marriage and the ability to consent within a marital relationship is viewed. Obviously, that has changed over time, but it's still, marital rape is still legal in many countries in the world. And so as, we are a country that brings in individuals from all over the world. So sometimes people come in with the views that they have from their home countries as well. And so it's just something that's really important to talk about and to understand, and because it can have very serious impacts on individuals who experience it. So we'll go over a little bit like the problem of marital rape. And then we'll talk a little bit about sexual coercion and how it might present in a marital relationship. We'll tie that into some new research that we're doing on adult sexual grooming. And then we'll talk a little bit about, how can we, prevent this and, start having really good conversations about rape within the context of marriage. One of the issues that you probably will face in working with individuals who may have experienced marital rape is that there's really not a lot of information out there, because forced or coerced sexual activity within marriage is really rarely discussed. I think there's still very much the belief that it is the expectation that partners are willing and able to engage in sexual behavior once they are in a marital relationship. And so marital rape is, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is rarely, a very violent crime. It can happen within the context of domestic violence as well, but that's not how a lot of individuals necessarily experience it, but it's a pervasive problem. Many women experience rape within the context of marriage or intimate relationships. And many women experience what's called coerced sex, and we'll talk more about that, which could meet the legal definition of rape as well. It's very interesting, like when you ask people about rape, they and who the perpetrators are, it's very rare that they would indicate that it would be a spouse. Obviously, those in domestic violence situations would be more likely to identify a spouse. However, 14 to 25% of survivors of sexual abuse, adult sexual abuse, are abused by a spouse or intimate partner. So it's very common. Up to a quarter of all adult sexual abuse that is reported is perpetrated by a spouse or intimate partner. So where does this kind of come from, this feeling of like entitlement within the marital relationship? So if we go back to the 1800s to British common law, this was specifically kind of stated in the common law: the husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract, the wife hath given herself in this kind unto the husband, which she cannot retract. So this ties into the historical belief that marriage is a contract between a man and a woman. The woman is therefore the man's property, and he can do what he wants to the woman, including sex. So she basically has given up her right to protest once she has agreed to marriage. And so this is coming from, the patriarchal model where the man has all the power, the women do not have the power. And this is only really, it's been in the last few decades that there's been more discussion of equality within marital relationships. But if you think that it was still at the beginning of the last century that women even got the right to vote, and that women only really started in the workplace in the last 3-4 decades, earning the ability to live independently from men, it's really kind of this is kind of entracted into our culture. And so while nobody would say today that a man has a right to rape the woman, to rape their wife, I think that there are probably many people who have beliefs along those lines, and that a wife is responsible, or a spouse is responsible for giving their partner sex in the context of a relationship. Um, so prior, and again, this is like relatively recent past history here in the US. And we're supposed to be one of the most, Western modern kind of countries. But prior to the 1970s, the legal definition of rape in the US provided exceptions for men who forcibly engage in sexual activity with their wives. So in many states prior to the 1970s, um, there were exceptions, such that men could rape their wives, and that would not be considered a sexual crime. And wife was very liberally applied to anyone. And given that many, men were marrying young women back in the day, they were able to then have sexual relations with a minor, which today could potentially be illegal, or even a ward. So, for example, historically, if they had somebody in their home, like a foster child, or the child of somebody that they were taking care of, the term wife could be applied to that person, and they could engage in basically child sexual abuse, and that would not be illegal. It was really only in '86 that the Sexual Abuse Act criminalized marital rapes. '86. So that's not too long ago. It's in most of our lifetimes. In '93, all 50 states had adopted some sort of marital rape law. North Carolina, I believe, was the last one in '93. However, even today, there remain kind of some obvious loopholes. Um, you know, It also used to be gender exclusive, meaning that it pertains specifically to men against women. So there was no kind of mention of same-sex relationships. That kind of aligns somewhat with how we defined marriage in the US, being between a man and a woman, until the same-sex states started passing same-sex marriage legislation. But prior to 2013, marital rape in the US was described as having a carnal knowledge of a female forcibly against her will. That also implies that a female could not rape a male, which we know can happen. We do have men who are, sexually assaulted within the context of their marital relationship by their wives. It was also explicitly reserved for sexual intercourse involving the male penile penetration of a female vagina. It was later in 2018, and this is as we started passing more same-sex marriage laws and the recognition that men can also be raped, that the FBI clarified that rape is defined as penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any part of the or object, oral penetration, or by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So it became much more gender specific. But some of the loopholes include spouses who live apart. That wouldn't constitute marital rape if one spouse forced themselves on another. And marriage could be used as a defense against statutory rape. So if you marry a minor. So how does marital rape happen? So, this kind of, again, ties into what we believe that rape is. You've probably heard of the term rape myths, and this is a big problem, especially when we're trying to prosecute adult sexual violence, because there's a lot of these myths about what a rape should look like. And so it's often believed that and I say real rape because obviously, we understand that rape is really not a violent crime, is a physically violent attack perpetrated by a stranger using a weapon that takes place at night in a deserted area, causing serious bodily harm to the victim. So if you were to go into the average jury and say, describe what a rape is and who perpetrates a rape, I think we would get various permutations and combinations of that definition. But what I found was really very fascinating is they did this great study in the United Kingdom back in 2016. And they really showed that what we define, what we consider to be real rape, or that myth, doesn't really happen in reality. So what they did was they looked at a police station over a 2-year period, and they recorded all the cases of rape that were reported over this period. And not one single one of the 400 cases that were reported matched that definition of a real rape. So the majority of those who were coming forth to report rape were abused by somebody they knew in a private residence, so not a stranger and not in a dark alley. And they were forced or pressured into sexual abuse, but they did not sustain physical injury. And so, that's a lot of, what you see in cases is they want to see, the physical injuries. And if there's no physical injuries and they're like, the person didn't scream and they didn't fight back, then how could it be rape? Because they could consent. We get a little bit more leeway with children because they understand that minors can't consent. But when it's an adult, there's the belief that if they're not black and blue, if they didn't fight back, if they didn't scream, that they somehow consented. And that's really kind of not understanding, the way that sexual violence works, that this coercive process that goes into play. So I've mentioned sexual coercion. So what is sexual coercion? It's a term that's being used more commonly now in popular culture to refer to the tactics that perpetrators use to pressure an individual into unwanted sexual activity. But it's still relatively poorly understood. And again, I think that's largely been because we have been studying stranger rape, because that's what people were afraid of, right? We were afraid of stranger rape, even though only 7% of child sexual abuse and less than 20% of adult sexual abuse is perpetrated by a stranger. So more than 80% of adult sexual abuse is perpetrated by somebody known to the victim. But then that kind of, because of the issue of consent and the fact that it's a nonviolent crime, people really just didn't understand that, and it's just been understudied. But we can see that coercion involves a wide range of behaviors, ranging from sweet talking somebody to pouting or trying to elicit sympathy to, on the more egregious side, the use of threats or physical harm to get an unwilling partner to engage in sexual relations. And I think the first two, a lot of people don't consider to be sexual coercion. When you use these positive tactics, or you kind of cajole, or you kind of manipulate people, like, come on. But all of that is sexual coercion. And it kind of is on a spectrum, again, with, some of the more egregious behaviors clearly constituting sexual assault and rape, and some of the more innocuous are the sweet talking on the other end. But still, like, that person did not want to engage in sexual behavior, but they were just kind of pressured into doing so. So in research, we define sexual coercion as the use of non-physical strategies and tactics to engage in sexual contact with a non-consenting individual. So this is somebody who does not want to engage in sex, and then the partner uses these types of tactics. So it can be pressure, come on, guilt, you're my wife, you should do that. Shame, what kind of wife are you? You don't do anything for me. Badgering, asking over and over and over again. And it's kind of funny because, if you look in the popular media, in movies and TV shows historically, the use of badgering was frequently used to engage, people in sexual behavior. And that's where a lot of people learn how to these, relationship scripts. And so if that's what they're seeing, that's what they're emulating. And so it's really important for us, when we think about prevention, to model, consensual behavior. Expressing dissatisfaction with the relationship, which can lead to kind of some of those shame and guilt tactics. Eliciting, sympathy, like, come on, I haven't had it for 3 weeks. I really need it. I'm hurting here. pouting, like, oh, come on, you know, I'm lying to say, you know, if you, you know, making up lies in order to engage the person, using verbal threats, you know, I'm going to do something to the kids, or I'm not going to buy you what you want if you don't do it. Emotional blackmail, you don't care about me. If you really want, if, you know, I'll go, if you're not going to give it to me, I'm going to go and get it somewhere else. Um, Ignoring requests to cease sexual activity, which obviously is the definition of rape, or using drugs or alcohol to lower inhibitions. And, you know, I think if many of us think back on our relationship histories, you know, there have been points in time where one doesn't feel like engaging in sexual behavior and your partner does, and a variety of those different tactics are used. I think what the difference between consensual and non-consensual sexual behavior within an intimate relationship is that if, you know, you ultimately decide to engage in that behavior. So if you say, okay, I'm going to do it, you have now given consent, even though you don't want to, it is still somewhat coerced. But sometimes you don't have a choice. Like if, you know, you're using those verbal threats or you're being blackmailed, and it's really not consensual, that you've not agreed, or physical, you know, consent is used, physical strategies are used. Verbal coercion can also be involve what is known as positive verbal coercion, in which one person pressures the other person, and trying to sweet talk them into sex. And again, this is constantly modeled for us, even today, in popular culture. So come on, you're so beautiful. I love you so much. Indicating that it'll be good for the relationship. It'll make us more committed to one another, or professing love. You know, I love you and you love me, therefore we should have, you know, sexual relationships. So, you know, these are not necessarily considered to be coercive strategies, but they can be. You know, like if you feel like you are not ready, that you do not want to have sexual relations, and the person keeps pressuring you, this can be, you know, considered to be sexual coercion. Whether it fits the definition of marital rape or not is very subjective, and it would be very hard to prosecute a case, but this has significant impacts when we're thinking about things like coercive control and, you know, power dynamics in relationships. Using these strategies can have very negative effects. We also see physically coercive strategies, such as, you know, starting to kiss and sexually touch a person who has said no in order to get them aroused. Again, you know, things that we have seen in popular culture. And about a quarter of women who have reported coerced sexual behavior report being physically held down, which obviously constitutes a rape. So unfortunately, sexual coercion is not uncommon. It's not really been assessed within the context of a marital relationship, but it's estimated that between 20, like 1/4 to 1/3 of all college age men have used sexual coercion since the age of 14. So that's a tremendous amount of young people using these types of strategies at a very early age. And one study of college men found that a third of them used sexually coercive strategies to get sexual contact with a non-consenting partner. So, you know, a good chunk of them, so 86% of them, reported pretending to care more for a woman than they did. A quarter of them used verbal threats, almost 20% used continual argument, and a smaller percentage, but they threaten to end the relationship. So we can see a lot of those same strategies that are used in marital relationships to kind of engage in this behavior. The other thing that we see is not only just, you know, kind of missionary style sex, but pushing, you know, women to engage within the context of the marital relationship in sexual behavior that they're not comfortable with. So that might be with, you know, a third party, that might be, you know, using, you know, BDSM or other types of, you know, kind of more graphic, you know, sexual violence that they're not interested in, and pushing that using these types of strategies as well. Another way that we have been studying, kind of understanding how these strategies are used is through the context of grooming. You've probably heard the term sexual grooming that's been used in the context of child sexual abuse, and that's what my colleague Georgia Winters and I have been studying, and I'll show you our grooming model. But we've seen in the popular media people who have alleged that they have been abused or groomed by their marital partner into engaging in sexual contact against their will. And it's typically an older male who has more power and control and a younger female, and they're using these types of strategies. So we have identified in children what we call the sexual grooming model, in which a perpetrator will select a victim who is vulnerable. They then gain access to them and isolate them from their guardians and caregivers. They develop trust with the individual by using positive strategies. Then they gradually desensitize them to sexual content and touch. So the hugs become, longer. They start, putting their arm around the child. They touch them on the leg until those boundaries are crossed. And then afterwards, they engage in what's called post-abuse maintenance, um, where they kind of make the child feel culpable for the abuse. They say, you didn't do anything, you didn't stop me, and therefore this is something that you wanted to do. But what's interesting when you hear adults talk about sexual grooming, they describe very similar processes. So in these contexts where people have alleged that they've been groomed as an adult, they see that their partner has chosen a victim chosen an individual who is potentially vulnerable. So these women have histories of abuse. They may have psychological problems. They may be particularly young. They then gain contact with them by marrying them oftentimes and isolating them psychologically from their families. So they kind of, make the spouse kind of the main person. So you see this in IPV as well. They then develop these strategies where they kind of love bomb them, right? They make them feel like, they prey on their vulnerability and make them feel really important. So everybody thinks that they're a good guy on the outside, and they make the person kind of fall in love with them and develop this trust because they care about them so much. And that's when they start pushing sexual boundaries, and they start, getting them to engage in this sexual behavior that isn't necessarily something that they feel comfortable with. And crossing those lines. And then afterwards, they engage in what, is commonly termed as gaslighting, where they make them feel kind of culpable, or that they, are misunderstanding what had really happened. And so while this was described in the popular literature, it hadn't really been studied as it pertains to adults. And so we've started looking at this. And we did a case study where a woman kind of who believed she was groomed described how, she really didn't realize for a long time that what had happened to her was sexual grooming or manipulative or coercive, that she got into this relationship and she felt like she engaged in those behaviors willingly, even though she felt a tremendous amount of guilt and shame because she was doing and engaging in behaviors that she did not feel comfortable in, but she felt like she was kind of hooked when he gave her those positive strategies. But she talks about so much gaslighting, so many lies, so much manipulation, the abuse of power, drugs. So you see a lot of those coercive strategies that we described earlier are kind of being reported on here. And she kind of talks about how her history of trauma, impacted her understanding of the victimization. Because part of the reason I told myself it was me that she kind of, wanted this or was a partner in it, was because it would be too hard to cope with again. Like, I've already been victimized. I don't want to be victimized again. This is somebody that I've given myself to, that, in the case of marital rape, that I'm now married to, and I don't want to be the victim again. And so really, feeling that you don't have that power and control, or that you've been manipulated or coerced, can be very difficult for a person to understand. We've recently tested our theory amongst adult survivors of sexual abuse, and 3% of them were in the context of a marital relationship, and 25% were current or former intimate partners. And a lot of them every single adult, if you look in the bottom right, reported that grooming behavior was involved with an average of 14 of the 42 behaviors that we identify as sexual grooming across all 5 of those stages that I described to you before. So they're selecting individuals who describe themselves as vulnerable for a variety of reasons. They're isolating them psychologically and physically from their loved ones. You see a lot of those trust development, the love bombing, kind of almost 5 strategies there. They're then pushing those sexual boundaries, and then they're engaging in the post-abuse maintenance or the gaslighting. So why is it important that we talk about, marital rape and sexual coercion within the context of a marital relationship? Because, you know, this is something that really can impact people. It can impact their well-being, their sense of self, their psychological health. We see that people who've experienced coercion or coercive sex and obviously marital rape report more post-traumatic stress symptoms, more trauma symptoms. It impacts their social life. They become more withdrawn. They feel a lot of self-blame. They experience psychosocial distress, and they generally have a lot of anxiety about sex. So while, sex within the context of a marital relationship should be pleasurable, consensual between both parties, that is no longer the case, and it becomes this very negative thing for these individuals. And obviously, rape within the context of marriage is still rape, and then you have all those long-term consequences to the individual who has been sexually assaulted. I think another important thing to talk about, especially within the context of marriage, when we talk about coercion, is also reproductive coercion, because that goes hand in hand with sexual abusive behavior. And reproductive coercion is when, one partner tampers with the other person, unbeknownst to them, so that they become pregnant. So they might tamper with birth control methods. They may engage in stealthing, which is a non-consensual condom removal. They may track the partner's period so that they engage in sexual behavior or coerced sex during times where they might be more fertile. And then they coerce the partner into having unprotected sex. And this is, again, when you're tying this into domestic violence, this is a way of power and control and manipulation, but through, having a woman who gets pregnant, and therefore, once a minor child is involved, it makes everything more complicated and harder for them to leave the relationship. And so those kinds of strategies also kind of fall broadly under the topic of sexual coercion. So what are some of the solutions, and kind of, what can we do to prevent marital rape, coercion within marital relationships and in interpersonal relationships? I mean, I think the biggest thing is education and talking about this, because, I think a lot of people, even in this country, still believe that you cannot rape your spouse. And so really understanding, that A, it can happen, and B, how these, coercive strategies might play out. And what is that line between, somebody who is maybe not in the mood, but they can be swayed into getting into the mood, to somebody, kind of forcing somebody who does not want to have sexual relations to have sexual relations. It's also, being an advocate, and I think this is the work that you all do, and really being there for women who are reporting these types of things, and men as well, within the context of their intimate relationships or their marital relationships, and helping them with getting out of those relationships, or giving them strategies to cope with this more effectively. And I think one of the biggest things that we can do is work with our youth. Some of the only evidence-based strategies for the prevention of sexual violence are teaching middle school kids how to have relationships. And while that might seem kind of a little bit backwards, when you think about it, like, where do we learn to be, partners? Where do we learn about how to negotiate complicated things within relationships? And that's by looking at, the adults in our lives or our role models. And a lot of people don't have good role models. They either grow up in homes where there's only one parent, so they don't see how that works, or they grow up in homes where there's dysfunctional relationship and violence is involved and coercion is involved, or they see, poor images or poor models on television and in social media. And so it's really important to kind of understand, how do you communicate within a relationship? Because, sexual coercion is often a failure of proper, communication. It's also a lack of egalitarianism in a relationship, and really making sure that young people understand, egalitarianism, because the more egalitarian a relationship is, the less likely there is to be sexually coercive behavior. You want to talk about consent, what that means, what that looks like in relationships, what coercion is, how to discuss sexual behaviors, how to have discussions when one partner would like to have sexual relations and the other partner would not, or the partner is not ready, and things like that. And so the more that we can, work with young people before they develop these relationship scripts, like later already in college with about a third of men using sexual coercion to get sex, it's really important in terms of preventing it for future generations and kind of breaking that cycle. So that is so I guess the important, take home from this is that nobody should feel pressured to engage in sexual relationships they don't want to have. And we have to really empower, people to believe that sexuality is 100% consensual. They have a right to say yes, they have a right to say no. And there's nobody that should force them or manipulate them. And, if they do, that can result in negative consequences to the individual. And so really, empowering people to recognize that and have these really important discussions. And, I hope that you go forth and have these discussions in your agencies and with your clients, and kind of recognize the importance of, this is something that happens and how to identify it and what to do if it does happen. So I will leave it there. I know we're a relatively small group today. So if you don't have any specific questions now, I have left my email address here at the bottom, and I'm happy to kind of share any research we have or engage in further conversation with you as you navigate this really kind of difficult topic, but an important topic, because I think it happens a lot more frequently than we know, because I think, especially in the context of marital relationships, it's not well reported or understood. And, as we continue to have more of these conversations going forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeglic, for coming on and talking. I am going to end the recording. So if anyone wants to ask questions, they don't feel like, they're being recorded asking. So let me stop that real quick.